much. I mean, I know that 9 o'clock, 9:30 is a bit harsh on a Wednesday, especially when you've all been out carousing the night before in the middle of the conference. But I do appreciate you all turning up. I've been spending a lot of time over the years thinking about change and the kind of environments that might sponsor it or enable it in different ways. And I felt, quite confident about being able to argue the case that there are particular types of circumstance in higher education which encourage or enable changes, positive changes to take place. And I was going to, proceed through and talk about this. But at the weekend, I was walking through the fields just above our place, up near Kirby Lonsdale in South Cumbria. And there's an old guy who has been certainly there over the last 19 years since I've been there, but is a local South Cumbrian man. He's called Harold. And he's a very, very able man. I mean, he can lay hedges, he can build stone walls, he can turn a pasture full of nettles and dock leaves and rubbish into a beautiful grazing land, and he is a really good guy, full of knowledge. And anyway, we were just passing the time of day, leaning on a wall, and he said, "Well, what you got on next week then?" And I said, I was coming here, and I was going to talk a little bit about change. And he said, "Murray lad," and it's always nice to be called a lad at my age, I find. So he was already kind of winning me over. He said, "Murray lad, change just happens, lad. There's nothing you can do about it." And I said, "All right, Harold, yeah, that's very interesting." And we wandered off, just sort of. I went home, and he went off over the hill. But actually, I started to think about what he said, and of course, now I hadn't prepared this. This wasn't part of my talk, but he was absolutely right. Change does just happen. And in fact, when you think about your own personal circumstances and compare changes which you planned and played for, if you like, and those over which you had absolutely no control, were completely unpredictable, and outside any possibility of you preparing for them, that the relationship between the two is quite marked. I mean, I remember reading something about 90% of the things that happen to us, the changes that happen to us, we have absolutely no control over them. And there is an argument for saying there's no point whatsoever planning for anything. What we should do is just respond flexibly and creatively to what's in front of us. So we have then organisational life and personal life where changes, more or less, are unpredictable. On the other hand, we have this, what's been called ontological restlessness. I love that. I mean, I don't know what it means exactly, but it means that we're continually searching to fill the gap between what is, what's happening now, and what we think we want. So there's a continual stress or strain to try and create circumstances that match what we think we want. This prescriptive impetus in us is very, very strong. So you have these two tensions then. Change is unpredictable, and most of the changes that happen to us we have no control over. But at the same time, we have a kind of psychological need to close the gap between what we want and what is. And I think that happens within organisational life, personal life, and so on. And the third area of tension is the fact that our practices, what we do on a day-to-day basis, our behaviours, are fundamentally engrooved, as a researcher called Huberman identified. If you can imagine, he was using a metaphor of a disc, an old-fashioned disc. So most of our practices then are repeatable and recurrent, and we tend to occupy this groove. And that's not an accident, because to be a human being, we like to predict how other human beings are going to behave and to respond to what we do. So there's a kind of, again, an ontological security. So on the one hand, we've got ontological restlessness. We want things to change. And on the other hand, we have a need for ontological security. Now, those three pillars really don't fit very well at all. And last week, I didn't realise quite how unfitting they all were until Harold told me that change just happens, lad. Now, I think he had a point. And running through what I want to talk about this morning is this kind of theme of unpredictability, the need for order, and the need to close the gap between what we want and what currently is. So, I spent most of my professional life actually looking, researching attempts to close the gap between what is and what we would like. We can call them what we want, we can call them policies, we can call them innovations, we can call them changes, and they of course happen all over the place at the macro level, international levels, and they also happen in our personal lives. We're always looking to close that gap, and most of my professional work has been involved in looking at that gap, attempts to purposefully change, and of course not taking into account the idea of this rationalistic myth that we can control and we can actually bend the social world to our will. Most of the time, as I mentioned earlier, we probably can't do that. But of course, governments are in a bit of a bind here, because if they didn't try and do anything on the basis of it probably won't work, then we'd soon have them out of office. And poor old Gordon Brown is now realising that happenstance, accident, the moment, and all the rest of it over the last year are things that he's had to deal with, which he couldn't possibly have predicted. So, you know, it's blown out of the water any sense of a coherent policy over the last year or so. So, change has been a preoccupation of mine, in particular policies which have been designed to create changes. So I'm going to draw upon some of that evaluative research to explore some of these issues. And I must try and remember to keep a bit of a pace on this. So I want to talk about what change processes are. I want to talk about theories of change embedded in national interventions, and I'll look at 3 of these attempts to change and improve practice. I want to look at the personal, or the personalising of change, and it's what we've called change or enhancement identities. What's the relationship between the way you have personal ideas of how change occurs and your sense of self within a change process? And finally, I want to talk a little bit about organisational cultures and their capacity to use change artifacts. Now that sounds a ridiculous term in some ways, but by change artifact, I mean a tool. Could be called a bridging tool, a boundary object. These are all phrases used in the literature to explain the sorts of things that might help moving from position A to position B in time and in space and in practice. So we need things to help us do that. And they could be simple things like a discussion paper or a website or even a conversation. They're all change artifacts or boundary objects in activity theory jargon. But actually, although the jargon's there, the idea that we need support and help in the form of different artifacts, I think, is quite straightforward. So what are change processes? Well, when we talk about change, I think it falls very broadly into these 3 categories, some of which are a lot easier to achieve than others. The first type of change is the change in rhetoric and discourse. Now, most organisations, especially HE, are quite good at creating policies. They're normally in texts, in speeches, strategic utterances, and you've probably had a bit of it over the last couple of days. And I don't feel at all critical about a piece of rhetoric. Remember, rhetoric originally, sociologically, is a call to arms. It's a way of mobilising people. So it's had a kind of pejorative feel, which it doesn't really deserve. Sociologically, it's a form of communication. Now, institutions are quite good at changing rhetoric and changing discourses. You just release a new policy document. I mean, Lancaster was quite good at rewriting its RAE results, for example, which was a bit of rhetoric, which I found excruciatingly embarrassing whenever I saw colleagues from other places. Okay, so that sounds a bit disloyal, really, doesn't it? But I was very irritated by it. Then you have changes in systems and procedures. ways of doing things. I mean, you can imagine if you wanted to shift practice within an assessment system, an organisational approach, you simply say, well, we're not doing it like that, we're doing it like this. And if you want to assess your students, then you're going to do it like this rather than that. Or some form of validation process for a new course. We're going to do it like this now rather than that. And quite often there's very little discussion and mobilisation of practitioners around these sorts of things. They just happen. And of course, practice by definition has to shift. So that's, if you like, a stick. A stick. The first one was sermons. There's a very interesting Scandinavian researcher called Evert Verdung, which is a great name to say. You tend to kind of hang on to the Verdung a little bit too long, and he gets a bit irritated by that. But he talked about policy change and practice change being involved with carrots, sticks, and sermons. And of course, this simple phrase is quite good. We have carrots, i.e. incentives. We have sticks, i.e. legislation and rules, and we have sermons, which are the rhetoric. And of course, if you put those three things together in an interesting and creative way, you've got quite a powerful impetus for change. One thing I would want to say about systems and procedures which are actually based on extant practices, as they're called, things that really happen, behaviours that occur on a Monday morning. Quality systems, I'm sure you're aware of, and quite often they have no bearing on what day-to-day practices are actually like. They're kind of abstractions of I suppose, a perfect type of practice rather than an actual practice. So the best systems and the best procedures are those that are actually real practices made into a procedure, a reified practice, not an abstracted prescription. So changes which are based on what people do or an enclave of practice are often quite effective as change mechanisms. And finally, I guess, the real gold standard, if you like, for a change having taken place would be recurrent, rule-governed behaviour on a day-to-day basis. So if we want to have or talk about a real shift in an organisation, like an HEI, then we really do have to focus on the sorts of things people are doing on a day-to-day basis, which embody a shift. Now, what's quite interesting is to speculate on the relationship between these three categories of change, if you like. And for me, I think it's difficult to imagine a chronology. Imagine if you were planning a change as a vice-chancellor. You say, right, first we get the rhetoric right, then we bang in some systems and procedures, and then sooner or later practices will have to change. Now, actually, that's precisely what most organisations do. If you can imagine in the commercial world, the way you rebrand, and then suddenly you're not allowed to say X, you have to say Y. And so in practice, there is a chronology. But in research terms, of course, that is very, very, in reality, uneven. Many, many occasions you have grounded practices in small enclaves of interesting practice, which then go up and change institutional life quite fundamentally. These are some of the tools that we've used for understanding. Now, I adopt, very broadly speaking, in evaluative research, a sort of social practice perspective. And that is that what we're looking for are, and how we depict social life is in terms of clusters of practices. So when you look at an organisation or a department, essentially what you're looking at are these clusters of practices around key areas. So you have assessment practices, you have staff-student communication practices, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of depict practices in that way. Now, if you look at an organisation as being hierarchic, then clearly there are certain practices which characterise each layer in that hierarchy. And if you inject an idea for a change into that framework, then each layer is going to adapt, reconstruct, and modify those messages in terms of their own practices. And this is a kind of given for us. So when we look at a change, we look at the way in which things are modified and adapted, reconstructed, and changed. In other words, it's the opposite of a rationalistic approach. I mean, again, politicians suffer from this problem of assuming if things don't happen, it's because they didn't explain it properly. Of course, it's got nothing to do with that. Things don't happen because people reconstruct, adapt, and modify those messages in terms of their own clusters of practices. Second point, there's a huge difference between changes embodied in a policy, i.e. in a text, a piece of paper, and policies in action. And you know when Ofsted goes into schools, they say, can I see your policy on gender? Can I see your homeschool policy? And people get out a piece of paper and say, here it is. And they say, oh, that's very good, thank you very much. Outstanding. And of course, we're saying that's absolute nonsense. So if you want to look at a policy on homeschool relationships, you have to look at what people do on a day-to-day basis, this idea of recurrent practices. So I haven't got much time for policies in texts, other than they are a statement of rhetoric, a starting point. And then you really, if you're talking about a policy or a change, you really do have to look carefully at what people do in terms of recurrent practices. There are lots of metaphors like implementation staircases, which I will refer to in a minute. The idea of a stage of concern. That's people have a concern with changes that move from simple awareness, I know something's going on, I can feel it in the air, and I've seen a couple of memos, right through to creative adaptations of those ideas where people are reconstructing those messages in terms of their own practice. So the stages of concern model is quite interesting. Final point down there is the notion of an enclave. This is very military. Actually, when I coined this, you know that diagram in Dad's Army, when you've got those little arrows sort of nibbling away at Britain from the Nazis, and the Brits sort of going back like that, like little terriers. Well, I had this idea, it did visually remind me of this notion of enclave. I mean, in an organisation, you've got enclaves of really interesting practice. Now, the idea is that from these enclaves, you can build bridgeheads out from them. They embody interesting practice. And then gradually, new embedded practices occur. Now, actually, that's a very poor theory of change, because there's no accounting for how you move from an enclave to a bridgehead to embedded practice. But it's an evocative idea. Most change prompted by government interventions create enclaves rather than changes in embedded practice, it has to be said. Right, just to return to the idea of an implementation staircase, this really refers to the way in which a policy idea from government drips and dribbles through the HE system. And at each point on the step, if you like, it's modified and adapted and reconstructed according to the kind of theoretical position I was talking about. So, you know, if we talk about, I don't know, employability, that'll be then reinterpreted by HEFGE. It'll be then reinterpreted by university teaching and learning policies. Heads of department will then reinterpret it. Teachers will then reinterpret it. And then students will construct it in their own way. Each of those layers are constituted by being a recipient of policy, a receiver of it. There is then this adaptation process, and then the policy is sent on its way. So you can imagine when the students actually get on some activity which is called employability, and you compare it to what government might have wanted, it's a very different thing because it's been reconstructed at each point in that implementation staircase. Now, I want to turn to the idea of this theory of change, which is embedded in a policy or an intervention. Now, a theory of change is it sounds a complex idea, but in fact it's actually quite straightforward. It's a theory with a small t. It's the assumption embedded in a policy or an idea about the way in which the activities associated with the intervention create the outcomes that they're intended. So it's the relationship between the way we're doing it and the kind of outcomes that we want to see. So it's that relationship that the theory, with a small t, refers to. What is their theory? Why do they think doing that is going to result in that? So it's that connection. So a theory of change is a tacit or underlying assumption or rationale which underpins an approach. Right, I'm going to look at these three, and they're all major teaching and learning interventions in the UK, all of which we have been involved in evaluating. Subject Centre Network, the Quality Enhancement Framework in Scotland, and also the Centres for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. And I hope that everyone's had some, at least passing, connection with these ideas. Now, each of them have these embedded theories of change. And we use that as a way of researching what actually happened in practices. In each case, we've had this idea of practices being the core. Now, the subject-centered network was based on a theory that the best way to change teaching and learning practices was through the disciplines rather than chucking money at the institutions. And the reason for that was that higher education in the UK is depicted as being essentially discipline-focused rather than institutionally focused, which is an interesting idea. In other words, you've got more, as a physicist, you've got more in common from Salford with a physicist in Exeter than you have with a historian in Salford. That's the idea. So physicists all over the country, all over the UK, have something in common which you may not have in common with your colleagues within the same institution. And of course, this is an old idea that as an active researcher, it's the discipline that binds you together, disciplinary culture, rather than the institution. Of course, as you mature, in inverted commas, in other words, come an alicadoo, as my son calls them, a bureaucrat or a high up within an institution, or sort of, I don't mean to sound insulting, but like a VP or a vice chancellor or whatever. You forget your discipline and you have an alliance with the institution. So there's something strange happens as you become more and more institutionalized and more senior. You leave the discipline behind and suddenly you're very loyal to your institution. Whereas young researchers, they don't give a damn which institution they occupy, apart from practical reasons and things like that. So that was the theory. Now, to a certain extent, the subject centre did work on that basis. It was very lightly managed. It was managed by each of the subjects, and it had quite a lot of academic autonomy. So the idea was it was a sop to the way in which the academic community actually looked at itself. The quality enhancement framework in Scotland had a different theory of change associated with it. It was, if you like, exploiting the otherness of Scotland in comparison with England and Wales. So with an emergent new country, with an emergent government, it was really important to have a kind of Scottish way, which was different to the English way. It was homegrown, it was lightly managed, there was dispersed ownership of this new approach to quality. A lot of people within the sector were involved in developing it. It had various dimensions, various review dimensions, student engagement, and so on. Now, we called it this idea of consensual development. So the theory was, if you give people responsibility to construct an approach to quality, which they own and they feel responsible for, then their practices are likely to gradually shift in that direction. A good theory, a good theory. And we're in the process at the moment of a second tranche of evaluation. And to some extent, if you're talking about a student that doesn't have any representative role, not a class rep or anything like that, but is involved within a department in Scotland, there isn't a concept of engagement, which is quite interesting. So if you just talk to any student, oh yeah, we are meant to be engaged with that. We are meant to participate in some decision-making about what we're doing. We do give lots of feedback about our experience of teaching and learning. So there is a sort of a trickle-down in this owned approach. And then we have the famous settles or kettles. Now, unusually, settles had a very clear theory of change, even though Hefke denied it. They said, oh, when it didn't work, they said, oh, no, we didn't want to do that in the first place. We just wanted to, we didn't want to create change. We'll spend 400 million quid, but we didn't actually want to create any changes. What we wanted to do was to pat people on the back. So there was an interesting shift when this theory of change didn't actually work that well. Now, the theory was that excellent teaching produces excellent learning. Now, that's not a bad assumption to make. Recognising individual and institutional excellence in teaching and learning promotes excellence, and this is the key, across the sector. The relatively light steer on specific designs for excellence will allow the autonomy of HE to come through. But the key there is that if you encourage very interesting beacons and enclaves of excellent practice, somehow that will infect the rest of the sector by contagion. It's an epidemiological theory of change. So if you walk past a classroom and something really interesting is happening, you get infected by it. And you go away and like sort of swine flu or something, you wake up the next morning and you're doing it. I mean, of course, it's nonsense. There was no theory of how these centres for excellence were actually going to infect practice on the wider front. So it was politically tricky for Hefke. There's a lot of money being spent on it. The idea of excellence and beacons were very, very much associated with Tony Blair. Gordon didn't really like this idea of excellence. He had a much more kind of diffused approach to change. But there was this idea that creating excellent practice or supporting excellent practice would somehow have an impact across a wider teaching and learning community. And that really just did not happen. There are some very, very good and very interesting creative practices associated with settles, but whether they're affecting the wider case is definitely a question still very much open. So you can see how attempts to change then from government does fall foul a little bit from this kind of rationalistic fallacy that you can control. However, when you, in the first two cases, have an analysis of the circumstances associated with those that you want to shift and change, you base it on practices like subject centres, like the consensual approach to quality enhancement, the highly owned version of it, then there is a chance that people will take it as their own and you'll have these incremental shifts. Now, it's not only at government level you have these theories of change. You also have theories of change at individual level, departmental levels, and also institutional levels. And in our research over the years, we've established that there are at least these 5 theories of change with a small t. First of all, there's this epidemiological contagion idea that you have a practice-based exemplar, fantastic practice, and somehow other people in the institution or the department will catch it. But you're not sure how exactly that will happen. But nevertheless, it is a very, very prevalent idea. And it's close to the idea of running a pilot. You know, you have a pilot to see if something will work, which has special funding with special people and a special sense of itself. And somehow that specificity will then be reproduced to the wider case with less and less resources. I mean, when you say it like that, pilots are nonsense, aren't they? They really are nonsense. Anyway, I'm slightly overstating the case, I think. Resource-driven and dependent. If you want anything to change, chuck some money at it. In a cash-starved institution or a sector like HE, you wave a few grand in front of people and say, well, look, give us a design for teaching and learning, and you'll get the money. And they say, well, what is it then? And then you say, well, it's a bit of this and a bit of that. Okay, categorically funded change, it's called. And of course, it's quite effective. Because if you haven't got any resources, then having access to resources in that way is an attractive proposition. The third area is something we were talking about earlier. And this is the idea that if you want something to change, the power brokers within the institution have got to come in behind it. And the rhetorical support, rhetorical practice is having the right policies in place, which can be very innovative and interesting, so that the innovators in enclaves of good practice, right down at practice-based level, can legitimate what they do with reference to the institutional policy and leapfrog resistance. Now, this has happened in a very interesting way, I think. It's a very interesting theory of change. So if you've got a very resistant head of department or faculty head or whatever it happens to be, you can often get support from institutional heads if the rhetoric is right. And they can outflank some of the resistance. And I'm not putting any value on whether the change was a good one in the first place, because it might have been awful, and the deans and the heads of departments might have been absolutely right. But as a mechanism, it's interesting. Now, the professional imperative as a theory of change is I think, also a very interesting one. And that's where the values associated with being a teacher, very old-fashioned idea, that you would do the best to construct learning designs which are interesting, rewarding, challenging, and creative for your students. That's what being a teacher is. So you're driven by a professional value associated with being a pedagogue. That's my job. I mean, that's what I'm meant to do. So I think that's quite interesting, and I think it works in a fairly strong way. So the professional imperative then as a theory of change is more powerful than one might think. People actually want to teach creatively in an interesting way, if they're interested in teaching, because that's what being an interested teacher is about. The last one there is the technological determinism. Now, I'm not sure whether I kind of fully go along with this, but technological determinism is about the way technology itself, the new technologies, digital technologies, have create an impetus for change in themselves. And they do it in three ways. One is that the technologies themselves that are available create new teaching and learning designs which were not possible before. You know, the use of live web resources within a teaching and learning design, all sorts of possibilities. You know what they are as well as I do. The second area is the global market. Technology enables institutions to have this kind of globalized approach to their education commodity. There's a commodification of education through web-based resources, which is quite interesting. And the third area is the determinism through the students and the learners themselves. They expect to be able to use technologies to support their own learning, because that's what they do through informal and non-formal mechanisms already. So it would be completely out of step with a whole raft of practices if students couldn't do that. So there is that expectation. So those theories of change are at the individual level and institutional level. And what's interesting, the most powerful raft, I guess, of change strategies would be a balance between these. So if I was a VC, if I was here yesterday, I would have said, you know, when you're thinking about changing the practice in an institution, why not create this dish, you know, this wonderful gourmet dish out of these kinds of practices, which are uniquely crafted for this institution. And by the sound of it, he's going about it in quite an interesting way, isn't he? I mean, he's actually getting to grips with some of the practices, some of the local environment and things like that. So I think he's kind of on the right track here. Right. Last thing I want to talk about is this idea of enhancement or change identities. And this is derived, again, it's all evidence-based, but it's kind of suggestive rather than anything else. I mean, it's just meant to be almost a bit of fun. And I want you to think about people you work with and even about yourselves, about where you fit around these change identities. And there are implications for how people respond to change. The prophet, I suppose Lorillard would be a good, I always think of her when I think of this. It has very strong vision and self-image as a visionary, interested in achieving changes in practice according to her own vision of good practice, not susceptible to a strong awareness of the change process, all have an idea of change theory beyond the exemplar. In other words, sit at my feet, let me tell you what we should be doing, and learn. Listen and learn. That's the model. Right. And then remember, these are caricatures. But I just ask you to sort of see semblances. The expert, normally on the technical side, but not necessarily, there is always the perfect platform. And of course, most institutions are riven with splits and arguments from the central information services, whatever they may be, and departments saying, I want to use Moodle. You're not using Moodle. Not in my institution. It's ICT, Web City or whatever, you know, or nothing. Well, I want to, no, you're not designing anything. We can't have bits and pieces fiddling around all over the place. So the idea of an expert in the technology area, I think it is quite interesting. Strong awareness of the way in which learning can be supported, but not that sure, apart from autocratic approaches on how to persuade people to get there. The democratic collaborator doesn't care what the vision is, as long as he's doing it with other people. Now, this isn't a bad theory, actually. It's based on the idea, if you get 4 or 5 practitioners together around a table and you're working on a learning design, something will happen. Something interesting will come out of it. So they haven't got a strong vision of what that should be, but the vision is in the design process, the collaborative process, which will yield something good. And to be quite frank, it often does. The campaigner is the sort of person that doesn't give a damn about the vision as long as that person holds the purse strings and procures the resources. It's to do with personal power. It's like a kind of wide boy. You know, somebody's selling watches. Look, don't worry about it. 50 grand, leave it with me, leave it with me. And off they wander. Comes back 4 weeks later. I've got you the money, got you the money. And, you know, what were you going to do again? And this is irrelevant what they were going to do. The idea was to have a power position because you're the procurer and the distribution of resources. And the last one here is the practitioner experimenter. That's the kind of person that just likes fiddling with ideas, who will, in their own classrooms, and a few like-minded people, play around with new learning designs, test them, and try things out because that's what they like to do. It's what makes them get up on a Monday morning. Closely related to the idea of the professional imperative, you know, the idea of developing because that's what teachers should do. Right, a few minutes. Now, last couple of slides. This idea of organisational cultures and the propensity to change. I want to go back to the idea of a change artifact. You know, something which helps a change take place. Remember, I'm not making any assumptions about what's a good change or a bad change here. The focus for this sort of research is very much on the processes, whatever they are, to try and understand a bit more about them. But let's assume that the artifact or the boundary object or whatever you want to call it, the tool for change has been produced. It could be a website, it could be a discussion document, it could be a lesson plan or a piece of curriculum, it could be a bit of kit, it could be a learning platform, whatever it is. But you have an embodiment, something concrete, with real people, real time, real place. Now, the work that we've done has suggested that that artifact is likely to have effects in terms of change within its own light, if you like, if these factors are present. Now, again, I'm kind of caricaturing this, and it's being more emphatic than I really believe. But first of all, it's how to inject the idea into decision-making cycles, because you need to have what Blackler has called an idea of embodied knowledge. And how do you get things done in a particular organisation or institution? Who are the gatekeepers? When do decisions get made? So you make sure your artifact actually coincides with that sort of part of the process. There's a clear understanding of organisational memory in the sense that it's highly likely that analogous developments have happened before. So this idea of continually reinventing ways of doing things is actually a real problem within large organisations like HE. And the third area is the capacity of the organisation to respond to a new idea. The first thing is to, as I said, to feed into the structures that identify and can act on the implication. So if this is the problem with the enclave of very interesting practice at practitioner level, without a kind of deft and knowing connection with how decisions are made and how you can place this idea with particular gatekeepers. And we have found that organisations that are lightly bureaucratised, in other words, are fairly horizontal, and encourage new ideas and decisions from a wide range of sources within the organisation, are far better placed to respond to tricky or awkward changes. Bureaucratised environments, you know, oh sorry, you know, you're going to have to pass it past Steve. I mean, it can't, if he does, you know, that sort of idea that only certain people and certain layers can make decisions. And of course, you know, HE is a highly bureaucratised environment a lot. So one of the interesting things is to change that environment to help with those sorts of changes. The power structures I mentioned, and the final one, which is quite interesting, is that idea of congruence. And again, it goes back to practices. If an idea is going to be modified and adapted by recurrent behaviour, then it's very useful if people can actually connect with it. In other words, they have one foot in existing practices and one foot in the implications of the change. And we have found that changes that are completely disassociate themselves from the practice clusters which exist have very little chance. Right, last slide. This is kind of going back up to the grand, really. This idea of chronic uncertainty. The argument is that most organisations, and certainly societies, in the West at least, are in a circumstance of chronic uncertainty. We really don't know and can't predict how to move forward with any great reliability or certainty. So we are almost in a continual state of transition. And the metaphor is that moving from one place to another in time, in space, and in practice means, in effect, crossing a boundary. You are actually moving from one circumstance to another. Now, it's very, very helpful, and I hope this kind of connects with some of your own work and also to what Sue was saying yesterday. Learners and teachers in HE can be supported by what we've called, and we're trying to be kind of catchy, is this idea of a provisional stability. And that's knowing enough about an environment, let's say a teaching and learning environment, such that you can make a forward step. It's not knowing everything, but it's knowing enough to make sense of what's going on around you. It's a sense-making, in Weick's terms, a sense-making process. And it's provisional. But it's enough to be able to say, well, this is happening now, and on this we can build. And we found that small-scale research, pedagogic research within institutions, acts as a provisional stability. It's a sense-making process, and it can act as a boundary object, a bridging tool. It helps to move from A to B, and is, in our view, evaluative research and its outputs, pedagogic research and its output, is one of the key bridging tools for change. I'll stop there. Thank you.